All right, welcome to another deep dive with us. This time we're going to be tackling Ares, the ancient Greek god of war.
Sounds good.
And, you sent over just a huge amount of info on him, mostly from the Wikipedia page, which really pulls from just a ton of ancient sources and more modern scholarship.
Right.
So think of this as our sort of guided exploration of him. Everything from, the meanings of his names to the surprising ways he was actually worshipped across different regions, to his appearances in myths, which are often not so heroic, to his really extensive family tree, and then finally how he changed in Roman culture into Mars.
Right.
So our goal today, I think, is to really figure out, why the Greeks seem to have such complicated feelings about this god of war, like their own god of war.
Absolutely. And what's really interesting right off the bat is that Ares is not just this like a one-dimensional raging brute that you might kind of think of when you first think about a god of war. The sources show us that he's really a deity with a surprisingly broad set of connections and a reception that changed quite a bit depending on where and when you were in the ancient world. So we really need to go beyond that simple image of the angry warrior.
Okay, so let's start with something pretty basic, which is his name, Ares. Sounds pretty straightforward, but I think even that has some kind of interesting layers to it.
It definitely does. The most direct connection you can make is to the Greek words ara or ara.
Okay.
And those translate to like bane or ruin, curse, imprecation.
Wow.
So right away, that gives you a sense of this kind of destructive potential that's right there in his name.
Okay.
But what's even more interesting is that some scholars think that his name might even be connected to a language that was spoken in Greece before the Greek language even came to Greece. So this is suggesting that this figure of a war god could have incredibly ancient roots.
So a name that's basically, synonymous with destruction, maybe even older than the Greek language as we know it.
Yeah.
And then we also saw that the Mycenaean Greeks, way back when, had their own version of his name, Ari. It's just incredible to be able to trace this back so far.
Absolutely. And then kind of building on that, the adjective Areos, meaning warlike, shows up quite frequently. And not just for Ares. You see it attached to other gods when they're shown in their sort of martial forms.
Okay.
So you have Zeus Areos, Athena Area, even Aphrodite Area. So it gives you this broader sense of how this idea of warlikeness permeated their understanding of the divine.
Right.
And if you go back to the Iliad, the word Ares itself was basically used as another word for battle.
Okay. So it's almost as if the idea of battle itself was just deeply tied to this figure, or at least very strongly associated.
Yeah.
Now, there was also mention of this epithet, Enyalios. And it sounded like maybe that was just another name for him, but maybe it was something a bit more complex.
It's a little unclear. The relationship between Ares and Enyalios is very interesting. Enyalios also shows up in those early Mycenaean records.
Right.
And sometimes he just seems like another way to refer to Ares.
Okay.
But there's other times, even in the same city-state, where he appears to be a separate war god with his own distinct rituals. So some scholars have described them as almost being like doubles, perhaps reflecting slightly different aspects or even earlier and later understandings of the same sort of core war deity.
Like two sides of the same violent impulse?
Yeah, exactly.
That's fascinating.
And the lines are not always very sharply drawn.
Right. And so we've got this other name, this possible other name, but then Ares also has this whole collection of these descriptive titles that we were calling the epithets.
Right.
What do those tell us about how the Greeks actually viewed him?
Yeah, these epithets really paint this very powerful and often very negative picture of Ares. You have titles like Atos Polemoia, which translates to insatiate at war. And that really highlights this sort of relentless, never-ending hunger for conflict that was associated with him. Then you have Andrea Fontus, which is manslaying.
Straightforward.
Yeah, very blunt. And then Brotoloigos, meaning plague of man, really emphasizes, these devastating consequences that the Greeks associated with him. So you can see this wasn't necessarily a god they admired.
Right, plague of man.
Yeah.
That's not a term of endearment.
No, not at all. And it continues, Menomenos, malignant, Myophonos, blood-stained, and then perhaps the most damning of all, Tiktan Kakon, which means complete evil.
Wow.
So, these aren't the titles of a beloved patron. However, it's really interesting to contrast these with Theritas, meaning audacious, which was used specifically in Sparta.
Ah, Sparta.
Yeah.
You'd think they would be all about the god of war.
Right.
So did they have like a major cult specifically dedicated to Ares?
here's where things get really surprising, and it might kind of challenge some of your assumptions.
Okay.
So despite Sparta's incredibly militaristic society,
They didn't actually have a major central cult of Ares. In fact, he rarely even appears on their coins.
wow.
Pausanias, who was writing much later, only mentions joint cults with a rather warlike version of Aphrodite up on the Spartan Acropolis.
Okay.
So it seems that their focus was much more on, the practical elements of warfare and military discipline rather than the sort of direct worship of a war god.
That's completely counterintuitive. I mean, Sparta, the very image of a military power in ancient Greece
Right.
didn't primarily worship the god of war.
It seems that way, yeah.
What about other parts of mainland Greece? Were there like grand temples to Ares somewhere else?
It seems that formal temples and widespread cults of Ares on the Greek mainland were relatively uncommon.
Okay.
Pausanias mentions an altar at Olympia,
Okay.
and then there's this intriguing case of a temple of Ares in Athens
Hmm.
that was actually moved and rededicated as a temple to the Roman Mars altar during the reign of Augustus.
And then, of course, the Areopagus in Athens, which is famously named after Ares. It literally means Ares Hill. Is significant because, according to myth, that's where he was actually put on trial for murder.
Really?
Yeah, and then it later became a court mostly dealing with serious crimes like homicide.
So a place of justice and law named after the god associated with lawlessness.
Exactly. The irony is definitely there.
Yeah, no, that's a pretty stark contrast there. So now you mentioned that cults to Ares might have been actually more popular in Asia Minor.
Right.
Tell us more about that kind of shift in focus.
Yeah, this is a really key regional difference.
Okay.
So in parts of what is now modern-day Turkey, cults of Ares do seem to have been quite significant.
Okay.
We have evidence from as early as the 5th century BC, and this continued well into the Roman period.
Wow.
And we have archaeological evidence from numerous sites, including over 70 local coin issues depicting him or symbols that were associated with him. What's particularly unique to this region is his role as an oracular deity, which we don't really see in mainland Greece or in the Roman worship of Mars.
So people in Asia Minor would go to Ares for prophecies.
It seems that way, yeah.
That's really unexpected. I mean, you'd think a god, associated with brute force would be the last one you'd go to for advice or prophecies.
It is very interesting. It hints that there was a more complex interaction with him there.
Right. Maybe they were trying to understand the currents of conflict or maybe even just, seek protection from them.
Exactly.
Okay, now we also have to talk about these chain statues.
Yeah.
What's the story with those?
Yeah, that is very interesting. So in Sparta, there was this ancient statue of Ares that was kept in chains in a temple of Enyalios.
Right.
And Pausanias suggested that this was meant to symbolize that the spirit of war and victory should be kept within the city.
Okay.
So it's a very compelling idea, like literally binding the god to ensure that his influence remains contained and, beneficial to them. And the Spartans weren't alone in this. They also ritually bound images of other deities.
So almost a way to control the divine.
Yeah, you could see it that way.
And what about those chain statues in Pamphylia? That seemed to have a slightly different kind of motivation behind it.
It did. So in the late Hellenistic period, several cities in Pamphylia, which were constantly under threat from pirates, were instructed by an oracle to create these statues of Ares, ritually bind them with these iron chains during a festival,
Wow.
put them on trial, and offer sacrifices. And the promise was that by doing this, Ares would actually become a peaceful deity for them, drive away their enemies, and bring prosperity.
So from bloodthirsty warrior to a bringer of peace and prosperity, all through ritual binding.
That's the idea.
That's fascinating. It really shows the regional variations in how people perceived him.
Absolutely.
Okay, now speaking of rituals, what kind of sacrifices were typically offered to Ares?
So typically, like many Greek gods, Ares received animal sacrifices.
Okay.
In Sparta, for example, after a battle, an ox might be offered for a victory that was won through strategy, whereas a rooster was for a victory achieved through direct force. And it's interesting to note that the recipient of sacrifice before a battle was often Athena,
Oh, okay.
really underscoring her association with, the planning and strategic aspects of warfare.
Right. Oxen for strategy, roosters for brute force. Makes sense symbolically.
Exactly.
Now, the material that you sent over also mentioned a long-standing error about human sacrifice. Can we talk about that for a sec?
Yeah, it's very important to set the record straight on that.
Okay.
So there's this persistent misunderstanding about human sacrifice to Ares in this supposed rite called the Hecatomphonia.
Right.
However, this was actually an animal sacrifice to Zeus.
Oh.
And it could be offered by any warrior who had personally slain 100 enemies in battle.
Oh.
So the idea that humans were sacrificed to Ares seems to be an error that's been repeated for a long time. However, Pausanias does mention that in Sparta, each group of young men would sacrifice a puppy to Enyalios before engaging in ritual combat. And then eventually, the practice of offering a dog as this kind of chthonic sacrifice to Enyalios also became integrated into the cult of Ares.
Good.
So not human sacrifices, but certainly some unusual animal sacrifices associated with it.
Puppies and dogs. Specific and a little unsettling.
Yeah.
So we've talked about regional variations in mainland Greece and Asia Minor, but there were also mentions of Ares being identified with deities in Thrace and Scythia, and then also Crete and Oxum in Africa.
Right.
Let's delve into those connections a little bit.
So these connections are really fascinating examples of what we call interpretatio Graeca.
Okay.
And that's where the Greeks would identify foreign deities with their own gods.
Okay.
So Herodotus, for example, noted that one of the three principal gods worshipped by the common people of Thrace was their version of Ares.
Okay.
For the Scythians, their native war deity was actually symbolized by an iron sword.
The sword.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this sword received blood sacrifices of cattle, horses, and even a portion of human wool captives.
Wow. That's intense.
It is. And some historians have even suggested a link between this sort of Mars and later Hunnic traditions.
So a sword as a central object of worship, receiving human blood. That's a pretty raw image of a war deity.
It really is.
How do things look different in Crete?
So Crete offers another really interesting regional perspective.
Okay.
There is a double sanctuary dedicated to both Ares and Aphrodite that was established there, possibly as early as the geometric period.
Okay.
And inscriptions reveal that they were invoked as witnesses to oaths.
Interesting.
And Aphrodite seems to have had a warrior protector aspect within Ares' realm of influence. So while Ares and Aphrodite are frequently linked in mythology as lovers,
Right.
this particular cult pairing and Aphrodite's martial role seemed to be primarily localized to Crete.
So in Crete, they were like a divine power couple in a very literal sense.
Yeah, you could definitely say that.
And finally, the connection to the Axumite god Marum.
So, in Oxum, the principal god Marum, who was worshipped by the Axumite kings before they converted to Christianity, was equated with Ares in Greek inscriptions.
Okay.
Axumite kings would invoke Marumares for their victories, and they even considered him an ancestor of their royal lineage. Their impressive throne celebrating their conquests was actually dedicated to him. So it's remarkable to see how this Greek god of war resonated, or was adapted to resonate,
Right.
with these diverse cultures and their own traditions of conflict and power.
Absolutely. It really is. Now let's talk about his characterization within Greek mythology itself.
Okay.
So he's one of the 12 Olympians, but the sources make it clear that the Greeks had these really ambivalent, mixed feelings towards him.
Right.
Why do you think that was?
I think this ambivalence really comes down to what Ares represented. So he embodied these purely physical, violent, untamed aspects of war.
Okay.
The brutality, the bloodshed,
Yeah.
in stark contrast to his sister Athena, who was the goddess of strategic warfare, intelligence and tactical planning. Right.
Places and objects associated with Ares often carried this sense of savagery and militarized danger. And very significantly, Ares is portrayed in these myths in ways that don't exactly inspire respect.
The god of war not inspiring respect. Can you give an example?
Yeah, the Iliad actually provides a perfect example of this.
Yeah.
So even Zeus himself, who is certainly no stranger to anger, sharply rebukes Ares when he returns, wounded from the battlefield.
Wow.
And Zeus actually calls him the most hateful of all the gods on Olympus.
Ouch.
Yeah, because of his love of quarreling and fighting. And Zeus only holds back from punishing him further because he is, his son.
So even his own father, the king of the gods, couldn't stand his warmongering.
Exactly. It really highlights the Greek discomfort with this kind of raw, uncontrolled violence that Ares represented.
Yeah. And we also saw that his association with the Thracians also contributed to this ambivalence.
Right.
How so?
Well, the Greeks generally considered the Thracians to be somewhat barbaric and warlike.
Right.
And they were frequently linked to Ares, who was believed to have been born there and to have taken refuge there after his affair with Aphrodite was discovered.
Okay.
So this association further cemented the perception of Ares as something foreign, untamed, and maybe even uncivilized compared to this more strategic and reasoned approach to conflict that was favored by some Greek city-states.
Right.
So yeah, he was kind of an outsider in some ways.
A bit of a divine outsider.
Yeah.
Interesting. Now let's get into some of the key myths that he's involved in.
Okay.
So we know he's the son of Zeus and Hera, but what are some of the other stories that he appears in?
Yeah, so while his direct narrative role might be less prominent compared to some other Olympians,
Okay.
he is involved in a number of significant myths. So, in the story of the Argonauts, for example, the Golden Fleece is guarded in a grove sacred to Ares, and the birds of Ares protect the Amazon shrine dedicated to him. He also plays this crucial role in the founding myth of Thebes.
Okay.
So he's the father of this water dragon that is slain by Cadmus.
Right.
And as a form of penance for killing the dragon, Cadmus has to serve Ares for 8 years and eventually marries Harmonia, Ares' daughter with Aphrodite.
Right.
And this marriage sort of symbolically brings harmony to conflict and allows for the founding of the city. And the plain of Thebes was even known as the dancing floor of Ares
Wow.
because of the frequent battles that took place there.
So even in the origin story of a major Greek city, Ares' violent influence is there.
It's there.
And of course, we have to talk about the affair with Aphrodite.
Right.
That sounds like it led to some serious divine drama.
Yeah, it definitely did. So the Odyssey recounts how the sun god Helios, who's known for seeing everything, spies Ares and Aphrodite together in the hall of Hephaestus, who is Aphrodite's husband.
Okay.
Hephaestus, being this master craftsman, forges this invisible net to trap them in the act, which he successfully does, exposing them to the laughter and ridicule of the other gods.
Wow, that's rough.
Ares, humiliated, flees back to Thrace while Aphrodite retreats to Paphos. And then there's also this later addition to the myth about Electryon, who's this young soldier that Ares tasked with standing guard and warning them of Helios' arrival.
Okay.
But Electryon falls asleep, Helios exposes them, and a furious Ares turns him into a rooster who forever announces the coming of the sun.
Oh, wow. Quite the demotion.
Definitely.
Ares seems to end up looking pretty foolish in a lot of these mythological encounters.
He does.
What about the time he was bound by giants?
Yeah, so the myth of the Elodidae, these
Yeah.
two giants named Otis and Ephialtes, is another example of Ares' vulnerability. So they managed to bind him in chains and imprison him inside a bronze urn for 13 months. He's only freed when Hermes is alerted by their stepmother and intervenes. Eventually, Artemis tricks the giants into accidentally killing each other, and this tale might even be connected to some ancient festivals involving these periods of temporary social disruption. And then in a separate myth, during that epic battle between the gods and the Titans, Ares is said to have killed a giant who was allied with Cronus.
Okay, so moments of defeat, but also demonstrations of his power.
Right.
So a mixed record in mythology.
Definitely.
What about the Trojan War? Whose side did he pick, and how did that go?
So in the Iliad, Ares' loyalty is actually rather inconsistent.
Oh, okay.
He initially promises Hera and Athena that he'll fight for the Achaeans, but Aphrodite, who is the protector of Troy, persuades him to side with the Trojans.
Okay.
During the war, he's actually wounded by the Achaean hero Diomedes, with Athena's help.
No.
And he's forced to retreat to Mount Olympus, much to the disappointment of the Trojans. Later, when his son Ascalaphus is killed, he wants to rejoin the battle on the Achaean side to seek revenge, which is a direct violation of Zeus's orders. Athena steps in again and prevents him.
Okay.
And then in this final showdown, when Zeus allows the gods to actually engage in the fighting, Ares attacks Athena to avenge his earlier injury, but she overpowers him by striking him with this large boulder.
Defeated by Athena, not once, but twice.
That's right.
The second time with a rock.
Yeah.
It really seems like the Greeks often portrayed their god of war as more of this raw, chaotic force that could be overcome by, strategy and divine will.
Yeah, very much so.
Now, who were his usual companions? We saw mentions of terror and fear.
Yeah, so Deimos, meaning terror or dread, and Phobos, meaning fear, were his constant companions in battle.
Okay.
And according to Hesiod, they were also his offspring with Aphrodite. Eris, the goddess of discord, or Enyu, the goddess of war and bloodshed, were often seen as his sister and companion. And then there were these other personifications associated with him, like Kidoimos, the din of battle,
Well,
the Makai, the spirits of battles,
right.
the Hismini, the spirits of manslaughter,
Okay.
Polemos, who's this minor spirit of war, or perhaps just another epithet.
Right.
And then Polemos' daughter, Alala, the goddess of the war cry, which Ares himself was said to unleash.
Wow.
Even Hebe, the goddess of youth, was sometimes depicted drawing his baths.
Hmm.
And then in Sparta, they even recognized Thero, meaning feral or savage, as
Okay.
this sort of nurse figure to Ares.
A whole entourage of war-related figures, and even a feral nurse paints a picture of this very raw deity, almost.
Right.
Now, speaking of family, Ares was pretty active romantically, despite his often unsuccessful battlefield exploits.
He was.
He had a pretty extensive list of offspring.
He did. So despite his somewhat limited role in these main mythological narratives, Ares is credited with a significant number of relationships and children,
Right.
most famously with Aphrodite, producing figures like Eros, Sateros, Phobos, Deimos, and Harmonia.
Okay.
But he also had children with various other goddesses and mortal women, each with their own stories. So, for example, there's Cycnus, who famously tried to build a temple made of skulls.
Oh, wow.
And then a daughter named Thrasa, whose lineage leads to a curse by Aphrodite and these transformations into birds. So the sheer number of his offspring, even if he wasn't always the central figure in their stories,
Yeah.
highlights his widespread influence across different myths and family lines.
It's almost as if his influence was more through these individual stories and connections,
Yeah.
rather than being, the star of these grand overarching narratives himself.
Right.
Okay. So we can't talk about Ares without talking about his Roman counterpart, Mars.
Right.
How did the Romans perceive and worship him differently?
So this is a really crucial distinction to understand. While Mars was eventually identified with Ares under the influence of Greek culture, his original role in Roman religion was much more significant,
Yeah.
and it carried this greater sense of dignity.
Interesting.
So initially, he was an agricultural deity
Yeah.
who gradually evolved into a prominent military god, and very importantly, this ancestral protector of the Roman people as the legendary father of Romulus, the founder of Rome.
Okay. So much more central to the Roman identity.
Yeah. He was seen as this force that could secure peace through strength.
Okay.
And he was revered as pater, or a father figure, of the Roman state. So really quite a different emphasis.
So a much more central and respected figure in their pantheon.
Exactly.
Almost the complete opposite, Ares' kind of marginalized status.
Yeah, very much so.
Now, the myths of Ares, as you said, were often reinterpreted under the name of Mars in Latin literature.
Right.
And Greek writers living under Roman rule also use Ares when referring to the Roman Mars. But the fundamental character and the level of respect given to them really differed. Mars was deeply intertwined with Roman identity and their success, whereas Ares often represented these more chaotic and less desirable aspects of war for the Greeks.
Right.
So fascinating how two cultures can take a similar concept, a god of war, and imbue them with such different values.
Very much so.
Now, how did this perception of Mars evolve into the Renaissance and later periods of Western culture?
So in Renaissance and neoclassical art, Ares' traditional symbols, the spear and helmet,
Right.
and his associated animals, the dog and the vulture, continued to appear.
Right.
However, in literary works, the Roman Mars was largely favored.
Okay.
And he often became this romanticized symbol of manly valor and martial prowess. So this was quite a departure from this often brutal and bloodthirsty portrayal of the original Greek Ares.
Right.
And over time, the distinct identities of these two figures really began to blur,
Right.
with the Roman interpretation often kind of overshadowing the more complex and nuanced portrayal of the Greek god.
So as you can see now, you were right. Ares was far from this simple embodiment of war. His worship, the way he was perceived, varied dramatically across the ancient world, reflecting, I guess, these different societal attitudes towards conflict itself. His myths often depicted him in ways that were, less than heroic, perhaps indicating the Greeks' own complicated relationship with the realities of war.
Right. And what's really thought-provoking here is this contrast between the Greek ambivalence towards Ares and the Roman elevation of his counterpart Mars. And this raises this really important question to think about. What does this tell us about how different societies viewed and valued the very concept of war? Was Ares primarily a force to be appeased out of necessity, while Mars represented a more fundamental and even honorable aspect of Roman identity? that might be something really worth exploring further.
Definitely something to think about.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you so much. This has been very illuminating. I think we've really gotten a much more nuanced picture of this complex deity.
My pleasure.
And thank you all for listening to this deep dive.
Mhm.
We'll see you next time. Tell us what you think about this episode. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.